Volume 2, The Architecture of Influence. Chapter 1, Influence as Structural Force. Influence is the internal force that shapes how authority is used inside a legal system. It is not persuasion, pressure, or personal preference. Influence appears whenever institutions must interpret rules, apply procedures, or make decisions within the boundaries of authority. It shows up in the spaces where rules require judgment, where procedures allow choice, and where norms must be applied to real situations. Influence is not something individuals bring into the system. It is something the system produces on its own because of how it is built. Influence comes from the structure of the system. Every legal system has hierarchies, institutional roles, flexible procedures, interpretive space, and limits on administrative capacity. These features create openings where influence naturally operates. They are not flaws or exceptions. They are predictable results of system design. Influence is not added from the outside. It grows from the architecture itself. Institutions do not function like machines. They rely on people, processes, and judgment. Influence shapes how institutions interpret rules, apply procedures, evaluate evidence, choose remedies, and prioritize enforcement. Institutional behavior is always a mix of structural requirements and influential forces working together. The system provides the boundaries. Influence determines how decisions move within those boundaries. Influence introduces controlled variation into the system. Variation does not mean instability. It means the system can adjust to new situations, changing conditions, evolving norms, and practical limits. Without influence, the system would be rigid and unable to respond to complexity. Influence allows institutions to adapt while still staying aligned with authority. It gives the system the flexibility it needs to function in the real world. Influence is always present. It operates inside authority, inside institutions, inside procedures, inside interpretation, and inside enforcement. It is the system's internal mechanism for flexibility. Influence ensures that the architecture can respond to complexity without losing coherence. It is not an exception to the system. It is a structural constant that allows the system to function in environments where rigid rule application would not be enough. Chapter 2, Sources of Influence. Influence comes from the structure of the legal system itself. It appears whenever the system creates space for interpretation, judgment, or choice. It is not an outside force or a sign that something has gone wrong. Influence is a built-in feature of any system that relies on human institutions to carry out authority. Whenever rules need interpretation, procedures allow more than one pathway, institutions hold delegated authority, enforcement depends on capacity, remedies must be selected, or evidence must be evaluated, influence becomes active. These conditions are part of the system's design, which means influence is woven into the architecture from the beginning. Institutions are one of the main sources of influence. They shape outcomes because they are the tools through which authority is exercised. Institutional influence does not come from personal preference or individual decision-makers. It comes from the structural powers and responsibilities assigned to the institution itself. Jurisdiction determines what an institution is allowed to address. Procedural control shapes how matters move through the system. Interpretive authority determines how rules are understood. Administrative capacity affects how thoroughly tasks can be completed. Enforcement discretion shapes how obligations are prioritized. Institutions influence the system because the system gives them roles that require judgment. Procedures also generate influence. Procedural rules decide the order of actions, the timing of responses, the availability of remedies, the admissibility of evidence, and the mechanisms for review. These rules shape how information flows and how decisions are produced. Influence arises because procedures rarely force a single mandatory outcome. Instead, they create structured pathways that require judgment at each step. The design of these pathways shapes outcomes by determining how decisions are made, not just what decisions are possible. Interpretation is another major source of influence. Rules often need clarification, context, or alignment with higher authority. Language may be unclear. Norms may conflict. Circumstances may change. Precedents may need adjustment. Interpretation is not optional. It is a structural requirement. Influence enters the system whenever institutions must decide what a rule means, how it applies, or how it fits within the hierarchy of authority. Interpretation keeps the system coherent, but it also creates space for influence to guide meaning within the boundaries of institutional competence. Operational realities introduce influence as well. Institutions must function within the limits of their resources, personnel, technology, and organizational structure. These practical constraints shape how rules are applied and how decisions are carried out. Influence emerges from the gap between what institutions are authorized to do and what they are capable of doing. Limited resources affect how thoroughly matters can be investigated. Administrative workload affects how quickly procedures move. Technology affects how information is processed. Expertise affects the quality of judgment. These operational factors do not replace authority, but they shape how authority is expressed in practice. Influence is not a single force with a single origin. It is a structural phenomenon that arises from the architecture of the system, the design of its institutions, the pathways created by its procedures, the interpretive demands of its rules, and the operational realities of its administration. Influence is built into the system at every level. It is not an anomaly or a deviation. It is a predictable and necessary feature of any legal system that relies on human institutions to carry out its functions. Chapter 3: Influence and Discretion. Discretion is the structural space where institutions make choices that are not fully determined by rules. It is not personal freedom, personal preference, or subjective decision-making. Discretion exists because no legal system can function with rules that cover every possible situation. Whenever rules allow more than one valid option, or procedures offer more than one pathway, discretion becomes active. It is a built-in feature of the system, not an exception to it. Influence moves through this space. Whenever institutions are allowed to choose among options, influence shapes which option is selected. It affects how rules are interpreted, how evidence is evaluated, how procedures are applied, how outcomes are prioritized, and how enforcement is carried out. Discretion provides the room for movement, and influence provides the direction. Together, they form one of the system's most important internal mechanisms. Discretion is not unlimited. It is bounded by constitutional authority, statutory requirements, regulatory frameworks, procedural rules, and the competence of the institution. These boundaries ensure that discretion stays aligned with the system's hierarchy. Influence cannot override authority. It can only operate within the space authority creates. The limits on discretion act as structural safeguards that prevent influence from becoming distortion. Even within these limits, discretion introduces controlled variation into the system. Variation is not instability. It is the system's ability to adapt to complexity. Similar cases may require different remedies. Procedures may need to adjust to circumstances. Evidence may require contextual evaluation. Enforcement may need to prioritize limited resources. Discretion allows institutions to respond to these differences without breaking coherence. It gives the system the flexibility it needs to function in real environments rather than idealized ones. Discretion is not a deviation from rule-based governance. It is a structural constant. It ensures flexibility, adaptability, contextual judgment, operational continuity, and institutional responsiveness. Influence and discretion are inseparable. Influence provides the internal force that guides decisions, and discretion provides the structural space in which those decisions can move. Together, they allow the system to manage complexity while remaining aligned with authority. Chapter 4: Influence and Interpretation. Interpretation is one of the main points where influence enters a legal system. Rules often need clarification, context, or alignment with higher authority, and these moments create space for influence to shape meaning. Interpretation is not a neutral act. It is a structured process where institutions must decide how rules apply, how conflicts are resolved, and how coherence is maintained. Influence becomes active whenever language is unclear, when rules overlap, when norms conflict, or when circumstances change in ways the original rule did not anticipate. These conditions make interpretation necessary, and interpretation creates the opening through which influence moves. Interpretive influence is not unlimited. It is held in place by the hierarchy of authority that governs the system. Constitutional rules sit at the top. Statutes sit below them. Regulations sit below statutes. Institutional precedent and procedural rules also shape what is allowed. These boundaries ensure that influence does not override authority. Influence can guide interpretation, but it cannot change the hierarchy. The structure determines the outcome, and influence determines how institutions navigate the path toward that outcome. Ambiguity is one of the most common reasons interpretation is needed. When rules are unclear, institutions must choose among multiple reasonable meanings. Influence guides which meaning is selected, how conflicts are resolved, how gaps are filled, and how norms are aligned with higher authority. Ambiguity is not a flaw in the system. It is a structural condition that requires judgment. Influence provides direction within that judgment, helping institutions maintain coherence even when the text alone does not provide a complete answer. Interpretation also requires institutions to stay aligned with the hierarchy of norms. Higher-level authority controls lower-level authority, and interpretation must reflect that structure. Influence affects how institutions determine which authority governs, how lower-level rules must adjust, how conflicts are reconciled, and how coherence is preserved. Influence shapes the interpretive process, but it does not determine the hierarchy. The architecture sets the boundaries, and influence operates inside those boundaries. Interpretation allows the system to adapt to new conditions without changing its foundational structure. Influence plays a central role in this adaptive function. It guides how rules apply to new situations, how emerging issues fit into existing frameworks, how institutional priorities shape meaning, and how coherence is maintained over time. Interpretation is both a stabilizing mechanism and an adaptive mechanism. It preserves continuity while allowing the system to respond to complexity. Influence ensures that interpretation remains functional in environments where rigid, literal application of rules would not be enough. Chapter 5: Influence and Enforcement. Enforcement is one of the clearest places where influence becomes visible inside a legal system. Even though enforcement is grounded in authority and guided by rules, it still requires constant judgment. Institutions must decide when enforcement should happen, how it should happen, and how far it should go. These decisions create openings where influence enters the process. Enforcement is not a mechanical function. It is a judgment-driven activity shaped by influence operating within defined boundaries. One of the strongest ways influence affects enforcement is through prioritization. Institutions cannot enforce every obligation with the same intensity at all times. They must decide which matters need immediate attention, which can wait, and which may be handled through alternative methods. These choices are shaped by institutional mandates, administrative capacity, procedural limits, systemic goals, and real-world conditions. Prioritization does not change the rules themselves. It determines how the rules are carried out. Influence guides these decisions by shaping which obligations receive focus and which are deferred. Enforcement also contains discretion, and this discretion is another structural space where influence operates. Institutions often must choose whether to begin enforcement, delay it, select among different enforcement tools, decide how broad the action should be, or determine how resources should be allocated. Discretion is limited by authority, but within those limits, influence determines how enforcement is applied. The system defines what is allowed. Influence determines which allowed option is chosen. Influence shapes enforcement outcomes in several ways. It affects the intensity of enforcement, the timing of action, the choice of remedies, the use of coercive or non-coercive methods, and the level of follow-through. These variations do not weaken the system. They are structural features that allow enforcement to remain functional under changing conditions. Influence ensures that enforcement can adapt to circumstances without losing alignment with authority. Enforcement is the point where influence becomes easiest to see. It is where institutional judgment, procedural flexibility, and operational capacity come together to produce concrete results. Influence shapes enforcement, but enforcement remains grounded in authority, hierarchy, procedure, and institutional competence. Influence does not replace authority. It directs how authority is applied within the system's structural limits. Chapter 6: Influence and Remedies. Remedies are not automatic outcomes. They require institutions to choose among several options that are all valid under the system's rules. This choice-making process creates a natural space where influence operates. Influence becomes active whenever more than one remedy is allowed, when remedies differ in strength or duration, when procedures give institutions room to decide, when circumstances require a tailored response, or when enforcement capacity limits what is possible. Remedies are structured decision points, and influence shapes how the system responds to breaches and disputes. When institutions select a remedy, influence affects the entire shape of that decision. It guides which remedy is chosen, how strong it will be, how long it will last, what conditions will be attached to it, and when it will be put into effect. These choices do not change the authority behind the remedy. They determine how that authority is expressed in a specific situation. Influence directs the selection, but the system defines the range of acceptable options. Remedial influence is not unlimited. It is held in place by statutory limits, regulatory frameworks, procedural requirements, institutional competence, and the hierarchy of authority. These boundaries ensure that influence does not turn remedies into outcomes the system does not permit. Influence can shape decisions only within the structural space the system provides. Remedies introduce controlled variation into the system. Variation appears when similar breaches require different corrective measures, when circumstances call for a tailored response, when institutional priorities shape the choice of remedy, or when operational limits affect what can realistically be done. Variation is not inconsistency. It is the system's ability to respond proportionally and contextually while staying within structural limits. Influence guides this variation, helping remedies remain functional rather than rigid. Remedies reveal how influence operates inside the system. They show how institutions interpret authority, how procedures shape outcomes, how discretion is used, how operational realities affect decisions, and how the system balances correction with stability. Remedies are not just tools for fixing problems. They are structural expressions of influence working within the architecture of authority. Chapter 7: Influence and Evidence. Evidence is not a neutral or automatic part of the legal system. It is a structured input that must be collected, evaluated, and integrated through institutional processes. At every stage of this movement, judgment is required, and wherever judgment appears, influence becomes active. Influence shapes evidence when institutions decide what information matters, what information is reliable, what information can be used, how conflicting information should be weighed, and how incomplete information should be handled. Evidence is one of the clearest points where influence affects the foundation of institutional decisions. The collection of evidence is shaped by the system's structure. Procedural rules determine what can be gathered and how it must be obtained. Institutional priorities determine which matters receive attention. Resource limits determine how thorough an investigation can be. Investigative discretion determines which leads are pursued and which are not. Operational capacity determines how quickly and effectively information can be processed. Influence moves through all of these factors, shaping the informational inputs that institutions rely on. Evaluation is another stage where influence becomes active. Institutions must assess credibility, consistency, relevance, reliability, and completeness. These assessments require interpretive and procedural judgment. Influence shapes how institutions weigh competing information, how they resolve uncertainty, and how they determine the significance of particular facts. Evaluation is not mechanical. It is a structured site of influence that affects how the system understands the situations it must address. Evidence must also be integrated into procedural pathways. Influence affects how evidence is organized, how it is presented, how it is prioritized, how it interacts with procedural rules, and how it shapes institutional outcomes. Integration requires judgment about how information fits within the system's architecture. Influence guides this judgment, shaping how evidence contributes to the final decision. Evidence is one of the primary channels through which influence affects institutional behavior. It shapes the factual basis for outcomes, the range of available remedies, the intensity of enforcement, the interpretation of rules, and the application of authority. Influence does not change the rules governing evidence. It shapes how those rules are applied, how information is evaluated, and how decisions are formed. Evidence is both a structural input and a conduit for influence within the system. Chapter 8: Influence and Institutional Capacity. Institutional capacity is one of the strongest structural forces shaping how influence operates inside a legal system. Capacity determines what an institution can actually do, not just what it is authorized to do. Influence appears whenever there is a gap between formal authority and real-world capability. Capacity includes people, expertise, resources, technology, and organizational structure. These elements shape how institutions interpret rules, apply procedures, and enforce outcomes. Influence emerges from the way these limits and strengths interact with the system's architecture. Resource allocation is one of the clearest ways capacity shapes influence. Institutions must decide how to distribute limited resources across competing demands. These decisions affect which cases receive attention, how thoroughly matters are investigated, how quickly procedures move, which remedies are possible, and how enforcement is prioritized. Influence moves through these allocation choices, shaping outcomes without changing the underlying rules. The system may authorize many actions, but capacity determines which actions can actually be carried out. Expertise is another major channel of influence. Institutions with strong expertise can interpret rules more accurately, evaluate evidence more effectively, and manage complex situations with greater consistency. Institutions with limited expertise may struggle to apply rules fully or may rely more heavily on discretion. Influence arises because expertise affects the quality of judgment. Capacity shapes influence by determining how well institutions can perform their structural roles. Organizational structure also affects how influence operates. Structure determines internal hierarchies, decision-making pathways, review mechanisms, delegation of tasks, and coordination across units. These features shape how decisions move through the institution and how authority flows from one level to another. Influence emerges from the way these structural features guide institutional behavior. Organizational design becomes a channel through which influence affects outcomes. Capacity can limit influence or enable it. Influence is limited when resources are insufficient, when expertise is lacking, when procedures cannot be executed fully, or when enforcement cannot be sustained. Influence is enabled when institutions have flexibility, when resources allow prioritization, when expertise supports sound judgment, or when structure allows adaptation. Capacity is therefore a structural force that shapes the scope, direction, and intensity of influence throughout the system. Chapter 9: Influence and System Stability. System stability is the condition in which a legal system maintains coherence, predictability, and continuity over time. Stability does not mean the system never changes. It means the system can absorb variation without losing its structure. Influence plays a major role in this process because it shapes how rules are applied, how institutions respond to circumstances, how procedures adapt to complexity, how enforcement is prioritized, and how remedies are selected. Stability emerges when influence operates inside the system's boundaries, guiding adaptation without disrupting coherence. Influence can strengthen stability by allowing the system to adjust to new conditions. Institutions face changing circumstances, emerging issues, resource constraints, and shifting demands. If the system applied rules rigidly in every situation, it would break under real-world pressure. Influence allows institutions to make flexible, context-sensitive decisions while still staying aligned with authority. This flexibility prevents rigid rule application from creating instability. Influence stabilizes the system by guiding adaptation in a controlled way. However, influence can also create instability if it moves outside the system's structural limits. Instability appears when discretion exceeds its boundaries, when institutional priorities diverge too far, when procedures are applied inconsistently, when capacity constraints distort outcomes, or when interpretive variation becomes excessive. These problems do not come from influence itself. They come from influence operating without alignment. Stability requires influence to remain within the architecture defined by authority, procedure, and institutional competence. The system uses several mechanisms to regulate influence and maintain stability. Hierarchical authority ensures that higher-level rules control lower-level ones. Procedural rules create predictable pathways. Institutional oversight monitors how decisions are made. Review mechanisms correct errors and maintain alignment. Standardized processes reduce unnecessary variation. These tools do not eliminate influence. They channel it into patterns that support coherence and continuity. Stability is achieved when influence operates within defined limits, supports institutional competence, aligns with procedural structure, reinforces hierarchical authority, and maintains coherence across outcomes. Influence is not a threat to stability. It is a structural force that, when properly bounded, allows the system to remain functional, adaptive, and coherent over time. Stability is not the absence of influence. It is the product of influence operating in a controlled and predictable way. Chapter 10: Influence and System Coherence. System coherence is the condition in which all parts of the legal system work in alignment with one another. Coherence is not about style or appearance. It is a structural requirement that keeps authority, institutions, procedures, and outcomes connected in a stable way. Influence affects coherence because it shapes how rules are interpreted, how procedures are applied, how institutions coordinate, how evidence is evaluated, and how remedies are chosen. Coherence appears when influence stays inside the system's architectural boundaries and supports the relationships that hold the structure together. Influence helps maintain coherence by guiding institutional judgment toward outcomes that fit the system's design. It helps the system harmonize conflicting norms, adjust procedures to real-world situations, align institutional priorities, maintain consistent interpretations, and preserve the hierarchy of authority. Influence stabilizes coherence by directing variation into predictable patterns. It ensures that even when institutions face different circumstances, their decisions still reflect the same underlying structure. Influence can also disrupt coherence when it moves outside its limits. Incoherence appears when interpretations vary too widely, when institutions prioritize different goals, when procedures are applied inconsistently, when enforcement becomes unpredictable, or when capacity constraints distort outcomes. These problems do not come from influence itself. They come from influence operating without alignment. Coherence requires influence to stay within the system's boundaries so that variation does not turn into fragmentation. The system protects coherence through several structural mechanisms. Hierarchical authority ensures that higher-level rules control lower-level ones. Standardized procedures create predictable pathways. Institutional oversight monitors how decisions are made. Review and appeal mechanisms correct misalignment. Consistent interpretive frameworks keep meaning stable across institutions. These tools do not eliminate influence. They channel it into forms that reinforce unity rather than break it apart. Coherence is achieved when influence aligns with authority, supports institutional coordination, reinforces procedural structure, maintains consistent interpretation, and preserves the system's integrity. Influence is not a threat to coherence. It is a structural force that, when properly bounded, keeps the system unified, predictable, and stable over time. Chapter 11: Influence and System Adaptation. System adaptation is the way a legal system adjusts to new conditions while still keeping its core structure intact. Adaptation is not improvisation or guesswork. It is a built-in structural function that allows the system to stay stable even when circumstances change. Influence plays a central role in adaptation because it shapes how institutions respond to new situations, how procedures handle complexity, how interpretations evolve, how enforcement adjusts to capacity, and how remedies address unfamiliar problems. Adaptation happens when influence guides institutional judgment without stepping outside the system's boundaries. Influence enables controlled change by directing how institutions apply authority to situations the system did not originally anticipate. Controlled change appears when rules are applied flexibly, when procedures allow context-sensitive variation, when institutions adjust their priorities, when evidence is evaluated in new settings, and when remedies are tailored to evolving needs. Influence ensures that these adjustments stay aligned with the system's hierarchy and coherence. It turns change into a structured process rather than a disruption. New conditions require the system to integrate unfamiliar information, demands, or circumstances. Influence shapes this integration by guiding how institutions interpret new facts, how procedures are adjusted, how enforcement responds, how remedies evolve, and how coherence is preserved. Integration does not mean rewriting the system. It is the method the system uses to absorb change while keeping its identity. Influence helps the system fit new conditions into existing structures without losing stability. Adaptation must always preserve structural integrity. Influence supports integrity when it aligns with authority, respects procedural boundaries, maintains institutional competence, reinforces coherence, and prevents fragmentation. Influence becomes destabilizing only when it exceeds these limits. When properly bounded, influence ensures that adaptation strengthens the system instead of weakening it. It keeps the system flexible without allowing it to drift away from its architecture. Adaptation is achieved when influence operates within defined limits, guides institutional judgment, supports procedural flexibility, maintains interpretive consistency, and preserves system stability. Influence is the system's internal mechanism for managing change. It allows the architecture to remain functional, coherent, and resilient even as conditions shift. Adaptation is not a break from structure, it is structure responding to reality. Chapter 12: Influence and System Legitimacy. System legitimacy is the condition in which the legal system is recognized as operating within its own structural boundaries. Legitimacy does not depend on public approval, moral judgment, or political agreement. It depends on whether the system follows its hierarchy of authority, applies procedures consistently, maintains institutional competence, produces predictable outcomes, and preserves coherence over time. Influence affects legitimacy because it shapes how these structural functions are carried out in practice. When influence stays aligned with the system's architecture, legitimacy remains stable. Influence supports legitimacy by guiding institutional judgment toward outcomes that remain consistent with authority and procedure. It helps harmonize interpretations, stabilize procedural application, support coherent enforcement, maintain proportional remedies, and ensure continuity across decisions. Influence strengthens legitimacy by allowing the system to function effectively under changing conditions. It ensures that variation remains controlled and that decisions continue to reflect the system's internal logic. Influence can also threaten legitimacy when it exceeds structural limits. Legitimacy becomes unstable when discretion is exercised inconsistently, when procedures are applied unevenly, when institutional priorities diverge from assigned roles, when enforcement becomes unpredictable, or when interpretive variation becomes excessive. These problems do not come from influence itself. They come from influence operating outside the architecture of authority. Legitimacy requires influence to remain bounded so that decisions stay aligned with the system's structure. The system preserves legitimacy through several structural mechanisms. Hierarchical review ensures that higher-level authority controls lower-level decisions. Procedural safeguards create predictable pathways. Institutional oversight monitors how decisions are made. Standardized interpretive frameworks keep meaning consistent. Mechanisms for correction and appeal restore alignment when errors occur. These structures do not eliminate influence. They regulate it so that influence reinforces legitimacy rather than undermining it. Legitimacy is achieved when influence operates within defined limits, reinforces procedural order, supports institutional competence, maintains interpretive consistency, and preserves system coherence. Influence is not external to legitimacy. It is a structural force that, when properly bounded, ensures the system remains credible, stable, and authoritative across time. End of Part 1.